Hello everyone, it is Joe here from OmniPoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. If you're looking for PTCG live codes, make sure you check out the Potown store. You can get a 5% discount on your orders using that code OmniPoke. For today's video, we're going to be going over the top 10 decks in the 151 format. This is, of course, just a holiday set, so very similar to the Obsidian Flames format, where we have already had a number of regional and special events. And in the 151 format, we have, I believe, 4 regionals, 3 of which are in North America and 1 is in Europe. It does seem like this is mostly a one-card set with Mew EX, but that doesn't mean that the metagame isn't warping around this card and what it can do against a number of matchups and how it can improve a number of archetypes. For this top 10, I am going to be looking at a number of factors, really. I've taken a community poll so we can get the overall feel of where people are at with archetypes, if they rate it or not. We have the Yokohama Champions League results, which was in this format. But of course, we've also started to accumulate some data from the online scene, seeing what's doing well, what's getting the most top cut frequency. And in addition to that, I've also done a fake CP earned calculation for all these decks in the over 64 player tournaments in the online space. There's been 20 events so far, and pause now if you really want to look into that in a bit more detail. I've also tweeted it out, so if you want to have a look at that in more detail, there's also going to be snippets of this on the video throughout. In at number 10 then, we have a real surprise deck, because the community do not back this one much at all. Only 4 people voted for Goodra in one of their top 6 archetypes. That was the sort of threshold that we're looking for here. But it has earned a decent amount of online CP, 155. For a deck that has a really low play rate, that's actually pretty solid. And it did receive a top 16 placement in the Yokohama event, which was an over 3,000 player tournament, let's not forget. So that is really meaningful. And wow, the matchup data looks really enticing for Hisuian Goodra. I will caveat this with a huge grain of salt. This is 1 week of data, and in many cases, Goodra has played up against some of these decks probably less than 10 times. So the percentages that you're looking at on the screen right now may not fully represent the actual percentages for the archetype, because we simply don't have enough data to go from as of yet with Goodra. That being said, though, intuitively, we can take a look at a number of these and say whether or not I think the data is kind of correct right now. I do really think that Goodra boasts a good time into Gardevoir. I will say that is quite likely. I also really prefer Goodra into the Rapid Strike deck compared to the other Lost Zone variants, because even though your opponent can get sneaky Yoga Loop plays on your Comphase in the early game and can take multiple prizes on your one prize mons, you are going to consistently just slam the Rolling Iron button in their face the entire game, and that reduction is really meaningful, seeing as though their actual attacks are really low damage output, and of course you have a Moisture Star option to undo a turn of damage as well at the very least. Sometimes it can be multiple turns of damage that you're healing off all in one go, so the timing of the Moisture Star will be important, but I do really like this archetype into the rapid builds compared to the other Lost Zone variants we could be playing. Also, this deck really enjoys the uptick in colorless Lugia. At the moment, it's saying it's only even, and the data's showing that it's better into the single strike build, but I would say intuitively that you much prefer coming up against an archetype that plays much lower damage output Pokemon like the Snorlax and Lugia itself with a fairly low damage output, seeing as though you can just simply announce Rolling Iron over and over again to really good success with their damage being so heavily capped. Of course, they can work in a Weird Ear turn, possibly, and that will really be one of the only matchups where you'll look to get double Goodra developed against the Lugia players, because in every other matchup, you're trying to mostly be a Lost Zone deck, but come out the gate swinging early with the Rolling Iron and force that question to the opponent of can they gust around this card, or will they have to hit into the Moisture Star? And if ever that's the case, you're going to get a really nice free turn. It also looks like from the data you're quite good into the Arvanzards, which is really promising, as this is a new deck on the block, really. Over the last few weeks of regional tournaments, and because we are getting a 70 hit point Charmander in the set, one of the only real impactful cards of this expansion, the things that I would look at from the dataset right now that I question a little bit would be why it has such a good Chien-Pao Baxcalibur matchup, and why it has such a decent Giratina matchup. Now, I do think these are probably going to reduce in their percentages, But that's not to say that gaining a Mew EX doesn't improve your Tina matchup, and you are going to still try and be quite one-prize focused into Chien-Pao Baxcalibur, and let's not forget we do have a Zamazenta which can trade into the Chien-Pao as a response uptrade after the opponent has commit a lot of resources to get through your VSTAR. So I can see how we will get wins with Goodra, but I don't think it's going to necessarily remain a 60+% as a very favourable matchup. The other thing that I think is kind of interesting is that it's showing right now a sub 40% time into Turbo Lost Zone variants, and I also think that is likely going to improve because of how frustrating the rolling iron is to get through for these Lost Zone builds. So just a small thing to note there. I have actually made a couple of changes from the deck list I posted just earlier this week. We are adding in the Zamazenta as well as an extra copy of basic Metal Energy to try and supplement that Retaliate option that little bit more. I had a few comments on this, and most people were saying that this really improves your time into Chien-Pao, so if you are respecting that matchup, it certainly is helpful, but it also just lets you retain a one-prize board state a little bit more against Colorless Lugia if need be, and it can be helpful against Giratina as well, just for some higher damage output as a single-prize Pokemon, because against Giratina, it may well be that you completely ignore the Goodra side of your deck and just commit to the Zamazenta, the Greninja, the Cram, and the couple Sableye, as well as your Rods, and really cosplay as a single prize deck for as long as possible, and use a Mew EX if ever your opponent gets frisky with their own Giratina. So that could be a line of play that you go for in the matchup, and Zamazenta makes that much more reasonable because you have a higher damage output Pokemon in the deck list. The cards I cut from the list was Hisuian, Heavy Ball, and Jet Energy, and really going on to the other options now, I really want a Hisuian in the deck list. Greninja's really important for the archetype, but we also have the likes of Manaphy, the Zamazenta, the Mew, some really important one-ofs, so I do think Hisuian is a card I really want to work back into the deck list. You can consider a few other supporter cards. Iono has that added flexibility compared to Roxanne, where it can still be a reasonable card in the opening stages of the game, especially just turn 1 if you're missing Colress, it gives you a deeper dig towards or at least Battle VIP pass, which is crucial, and of course, if your opponent knows you only play Roxanne, to some extent certain archetypes can play around the hand disruption and put themselves in a position where it's not too big of an issue. Clara, again, could be one of these cards that helps you stay on that single prize map, where it gives you easy recovery for the likes of your Sableye, your Cram, that sort of thing. And there is somewhat of a debate around these stadium cards. Pokestop could give you a deeper dig towards some of your items, and Temple of Sinnoh could help out against Mew to an extent, forcing at least a stadium bounce, as well as the Single Strike Lugia build, which I don't think is, like, terrible for you, and the data doesn't really suggest that, but it's something that we've seen in previous Goodra lists actually attempt to have to give themselves a better time into Lugias, because we do know they can push through with some of their Pokemon. The one thing I'll note, though, is that Urshifu was much less popular in Single Strike Lugia, and that was one of the bigger concerns for the deck. In at number 9, then, we have Chien-Pao EX. I've combined the votes for the Baxcalibur and the Palkia builds of Chien-Pao here to 41 votes from the community, and the online CP is also combined here for 340. However, the matchup data that you're looking at is going to be the Baxcalibur build only. That is because it's the more popular build right now in online data, and it's received the more championship points. The one thing I will note, though, is that it was actually the Palkia build that was more successful in Yokohama itself, where it got 2 top 16 placements and nothing from the Baxcalibur side of things. The matchup spread isn't that great for Chien-Pao EX, and I know there has been a lot of recent talk about the new Canadian list, and there is some great content out there recently discussing the actual 60 itself and the gameplay around the Chien-Pao deck, but I'm still looking at this data, and since Chien-Pao has released, it hasn't really changed too much, and it still, to me, seems like it's an inconsistent archetype. The data really reflects that, with even decks that you would think would be good on paper, like Gardevoir. This is a deck that can sometimes play double Cancelling Cologne, let's not forget, where you can have multiple Greninja spread plays, and Greninja heavily damages its own Pokemon so often that almost every turn of the game a Greninja Cologne play would be very powerful against them. The matchup data is still coming out as a fairly even matchup, which is just such an indictment on this archetype, which shows how fragile it is in the opening stages. Gardevoir simply picking off Frigibax or picking off early Bidoof from this deck, if they don't have that optimal turn 1 where they go completely wide immediately, they can really suffer. And I think that's going to be the case in a number of these matchups where you have a game plan as Chien-Pao, but things don't align in the hand all the time. You're going to draw into your multiple superiors and your rods and whatnot before you find your Iridas, your VIPs, and if you just draw out of sequence with this archetype, it does feel pretty rough to me. But I am quietly encouraged that there will be still a decent amount of people piloting Chien-Pao, because of the recent content around the archetype, and the matchup guide in particular was quite eye-opening for some people who have possibly been piloting Chien-Pao incorrectly all this time, so having their mentality shifted with the archetype might improve this deck's win rate overall. For the deck list, I am really taking a lot of inspiration from the successful Canadian deck list from the World Championships and from Pittsburgh. I am adding in one Pokegear over a copy of Cancelling Cologne, and I know Cologne is integral to some of your win rates into Guardian, into Lost Zone. I completely understand that. But this is somewhat of a meta call where I'm expecting possibly less turbo Lost Zone box because of the potential rise of Colorless Lugia, which we'll get onto in a moment. But also, Pokegear just gives you extra reach towards your Iridas, as well as your one-off Iono, which is just such a crucial card in the archetype. You definitely need to have access to your Candy backs early on, and Irida is still just a really important card for getting your next Chien-Pao rolling, getting your crucial superiors throughout the game as well. And also the Pokegear has minor upside as you're adding to your item density with Pokestop hits as well. So it means that if you are in that panic situation, only Irida will get you out of that spot. Sometimes a Pokestop still hits your higher roll of gear, which then gets you into the Irida as well. So just a tiny note there, but overall it's still very true to the Canadian list. For other options, we continue to see some of the VSTARs partner up with the Chien-Pao deck, doing fairly well online here and there. Boss's Orders could also be an interesting inclusion to go alongside your cross switchers, just to give you extra potential to Gust. And Luminion V could come into the deck as, once again, a means of giving yourself extra outs towards your Irida, because you play such a low count of actual supporter cards. I know that it's a 2-prize Pokemon coming into play, which can be a big no-no for this archetype. But if you are using this in the very late game just to close, that could be fantastic. Or if it's the difference between passing and doing literally nothing and using a fish, which can sometimes hurt your prize map, you still sometimes just want to use that Luminous Sign and get into the game. In at number 8 then, once again, I'm combining the CP and the community votes for both builds of Mew here, and I will be showing off both deck lists, a double turbo energy list and a fusion energy build, which is what the matchup data is reflecting here. Mew definitely has to worry about Charizard. That's one of your new, very unfavorable matchups. The Arvanzard is such a big concern for the deck that it is really putting people on the back foot with Mew, whereas previously it felt like over and over again a safe play, and now it looks like there's a real archetype that you want to dodge right now. I also think the colorless Lugia isn't the easiest matchup for you either. They're always piloting a Drapion in their deck list because it also gives them uptrade potential into the Gardevoir matchup, so it's not really a tech inclusion, it's just solidly in their deck list, which is a bit of a worry. One thing I will note is that the data is really demonstrating that the Turbo Lost Zone variants are also very bad for you. But I have noticed recently in deck lists, a number of players are dropping Drapion in favor of Mew EX. So the data might be showing that Turbo is very bad for you, but going into the next set of regionals, that could be an improving matchup, which is something I wanted to identify. You do boast still a couple of really nice matchups. One of the only archetypes that feels very confident going into the Rapid Strike matchup also seems to be favored into Chien-Pao and Miraidon, some of the more aggressive racing decks in the game. You seem to still have the beating of those. And of course, having a somewhat favorable Gardevoir is also a really nice boast to have. That's mostly thanks to the Lost City Ice Cube package that we are going to be rocking in the Fusion Energy build. So for the Fusion list, I am trying to hybrid a little bit here with that second copy of Judge as well as that second copy of Path to the Peak. I really think this is going to help you out against the Charizard matchup, certainly trying to slow down the Arven builds, where you're trying to not only force them to find candy into their Pokemon, but also try and find their lost vacuums or their stadiums, and ultimately they don't play a huge count of these, so sometimes if you are judging and throwing that path in their face, it helps you buy a turn here or there, and at that point you're looking to block slide or echo through their early board and really pick it apart before the opponent gets into the game too much. Outside of that, it's still looking very similar to the successful Worlds builds. There's also a DTE-based build of Mew. There's a lot of murmurs around this archetype. The question mark of Spiritomb is still up in the air. However, many players may have the narrative that Charizard deals with Mew. It's a less popular play. It may end up being a sub 5% deck. Do I really want to commit a space in my list to play that Drapion or play that Spiritomb, most notably for DTE Mew? And if that's the case, if they are being cut from deck lists, you are once again free to use this archetype, where you lean back into this hand disruption with the high counter path of the peak and 3 copies of Judge in the deck list to just slam this on the opponent. Once again, this is your win condition into the Charizard builds, but universally this can be a huge frustration. There isn't much Judge path in the format because Arceus has fallen off recently, so Mew might be filling that slot in the metagame where you're just putting everyone into that position where they have to be drawing well immediately, otherwise you're going to steal the game away from them. For other options with Mew, Town Store adds to your Stadium bounce count whilst also giving you an out towards your Forest Seal Stone, so it was definitely a reasonable include, especially when Box of Disaster plus Choice Belt or Cleansing Gloves, these sorts of cards, are becoming more and more staple in Mew. Having that variety package of tools and having a Town Store in your deck list is fairly reasonable to have. Penny could be a good way to offset the prize map for certainly Lost Zone box players, so it is a consideration card if you're expecting that to be popular. Echoing Horn can help you carve out an easier prize map, and Grabber is the new item card from this set, which has had a little bit of attention. It can add towards your Judge disruption where you're trying to put cards to the bottom of your opponent's deck. This is obviously going to be a huge frustration for Lugia players, which has received a lot of hype recently, but additionally can be annoying for Charizard players and Gardevoir players, so there can be a lot of spots where a well-timed Grabber can really ruin an opponent's hand. In at number 7 we have Rapid Strike Box. I was really surprised how few people voted for this archetype to be a top performer in the next few regionals, because it has already won a special event in Barcelona in the Obsidian Flames format. It did very well at Worlds, it did very well at the NAIC, of course, winning a huge event, and it's still achieving a decent amount of online championship points with 634 over the last few days, and it also got a top 4 placement in Yokohama. At the end of the day, it is what it always has been, a dodge and weave archetype. If the death of Mew was greatly over-exaggerated, or if you think there will be more players looking towards piloting Lugia thanks to the uptick in the colourless success recently, that is going to be a huge concern for the archetype. If, however, you're still thinking that the most popular decks in the room are going to be the likes of the Giratinas, the Lost Zone boxes, and the Gardevoirs, this archetype still seems fairly safe. I will note that Mew EX is sometimes a frustration, making your Miraidon matchup less powerful, but the data is still showing this as a favourable matchup overall. Let's not forget that Mew EX cannot knock out the Urshifu itself unless they also combine it with a Choice Belt, so it is a frustration that your artillery oftentimes gets rapid flowed, but you can still play the game after that. It's cool to see that your Charizard matchup looks pretty okay as well. Do be aware that you can't hit the Charizard on the bench thanks to their Terrastal traits, so you are going to have to play around which bench Pokemon you try and pick off. The deck list itself hasn't changed too much from the World Championships and the NAIC and whatnot. It's still looking like a very similar 60. One thing I will note is that a second copy of Cheryl is definitely an interesting talking point, because it can be a very big card into the Lugia matchup and into the Charizard matchup to buy yourself a free turn, now that we know many of the colourless builds of Lugia won't have the reach into your Inteleon VMAX, so finding these throughout the game could be massive. For other options, there is the Spiritomb Giacomo combo if you want to give yourself a safer time into Lugia. Sometimes you're disrupting them out the game by denying their Luminion V, and of course the Giacomo is helping against the fusion builds where you remove all of their fusion energy from their Genesect and immediately stop their draw power. And a Boss's Orders now becomes a consideration card, mostly because of that Charizard. You can't snipe them, so having to bring them back into the active after putting a decent amount of resources into trying to two-shot them could be pretty okay, because it may well sit so far out of range that you simply can't spoon plus double gun your way towards knocking out the Charizard. It might be much more effective just to bring it back into the active position and attack it for the turn. In at number 6 then we have Miraidon Flaffy. This is actually the archetype that won the Yokohama Champions League, as well as getting a top 8 placement as well. It's achieved 88 community votes and has 654 online championship points. Its matchup spread is pretty interesting, and it has gained a lot from the 151 set comparative to other archetypes, because the Mew EX seems to be such a natural fit in the archetype, as well as Zapdos EX potentially being another attacking option. The matchup spread is interesting for the deck. It boasts a really good time into the new colourless Lugia and definitely prefers attention being drawn to that archetype compared to the single strike builds, so this deck might be getting slightly better placed with a shift in the metagame. It seems to fight fairly well into the Charizard builds, and I do think some path-based Miraidons might be the reasons for that. And if people are scared to play the Mew archetype, that's also a big win for the Miraidon players, because that was also one of your more challenging matchups. Like I said, for the deck list, I am backing the Path to the Peak build as the right stadium of choice. There is a hot debate of which one to be playing in the deck, but I do think that with Charizard and Gardevoir, you do have to respect these stage 2 archetypes, and giving yourself that Path to the Peak disruption option with the Judge and the Iono in the deck does does give you a fighting chance. Speaking of which, I am still a fan of the Flying Pikachu V. I do think Thundershock can bail you out in a number of situations, and gives the deck a secondary pivot alongside the Mew EX. And of course, this is a Lightning type, so it's much more searchable in the opening stages with that tandem unit. Like I said, for Miraidon players, the Stadium is the most contentious subject. I've experimented with the Beach Court and the Town Store, Beach Court giving you more consistency of a turn 1 going second attack, Town Store giving you great access to not only your Forest Seal Stone, but also your Bravery Charms, which can be massive specifically into the Charizard matchups when you are getting aggressive in the early stages. Collapse Stadium can help out against Lost Zone box matchups, and the Lost Vacuum could actually be a very solid Mirror Tech card, as well as being an Arven searchable bounce to a Stadium. I've overall been uninspired by Zapdos Hawlucha, but it does admittedly give you more avenues of play. Zeraora is another handy single prize basic that you could be playing in the deck as a sacrificial lamb if you're not wanting to give up an early 2-prize Pokemon, and a Drapion V would certainly stabilize the Mew matchup if you think it's still going to be a popular deck in the room. In at number 5 then, we have Giratina Lost Box. This got 2 top 16 placements in Yokohama, has a decent amount of community votes, and has achieved 947 CP. At this point in the video, I'm going to say that the bottom 5 decks are definitely the bottom 5, and the top 5 decks definitely seem like a step above, and I really think you should be honing in on these 5 of all things if you want to give yourself the highest probability of success. Giratina was touted to be the big diff throughout the Obsidian Flames format, but never really backed it up with tournament results, and now it has to be slightly concerned about Mew EX sneaking into a couple of archetypes, but it doesn't seem to have stopped the archetype achieving a decent amount of points here and getting some good results. One of the bigger boasts actually is that it's very capable at challenging Charizard. I was quite surprised to see the online data have the Arvenzard as only an even matchup, because whenever I've played this, it's felt very good from the Giratina side of things. That's the main standout from this graph that I question. Everything looks pretty reasonable from that stage. I am slightly concerned for Giratina now that Colorless Lugia has had a wave of popularity behind it, because that really is a challenging matchup. It's really inefficient to be lost impacting or shredding through Snorlax the entire game, but that's your main option in the archetype because your Cramorant and Sableye are so ineffective at dealing with these Snorlax. I'm keeping things pretty simple with the deck list, but there are a few tech options that I definitely want to discuss here, and it's mostly going to be based around some of your weaker matchups, the Mew and the Lugia. Choice Belt and Spiritomb sits in that sort of middle ground where they're solid against both Mew and Lugia to an extent. The Choice Belt being the more proactive, you can get through a V-Guard energy with Lost Impact, and you can reach 310 into the Mew, whereas the Spiritomb is more passive, hoping that you slow down the draw power of both of these archetypes and deny their setup, whereas Temple of Sinnoh is much more, I want to deal with the Lugia matchup, because this can not only allow you to knock out a Lugia with a Lost Impact even through the V-Guard energy, similar to the Choice Belt, but at the same time you're also denying Gift energy, allowing your Hand Disruption supporters to be more effective. The Temple, however, does basically nothing into the Mew matchup, so I personally prefer the Spiritomb or the Choice Belt options. Michael Primarot piloted Snorlax in his Giratina decklist to the top 4 of the World Championships, and there's even more reason to be looking at this card actually. It can help you out in the colorless Lugia matchup by giving you an effective attacker through their own Snorlax, and this can also give you a really nice single prize response KO on Mew EX if people are choosing to tech against you. I'm also choosing to play just Roxanne in the deck right now, but Iono does give you an extra turn 1 supporter if you're whiffing Colress, so it can give you that deeper dig into the deck to at least find some ball search and get going in the game, and it has that flexibility of being used at any time if the opponent is starting to amass a hand size and avoid getting around that Roxanne turn, you still can refresh their hand. In at number 4 then, we have Charizard EX. I've lumped all the archetypes together here for the community votes as well as the online CP earned, because there are so many ways Charizard is being played in the game right now. It got a top 8 placement with a Gallade package in Yokohama, but this has been by far the least successful list in the online data. It seems like a lot more people are putting stock into the Arven build of Charizard, which did well in Curitiba, and you'll notice I've also got the Lost Zone build of Charizard on our matchup data, because that's also had a fantastic placement in the Barcelona special event. Overall, the matchup data doesn't look that appealing for Charizard, but I do think the archetype is still being figured out that little bit. I do agree that the Gardevoir matchup isn't all that favourable. We have seen Mawile be a drastic tech inclusion to help out that matchup and sweep the rug from under the Gardevoir players, but now that cat's out the bag, I feel like there might be alternatives to improve that matchup, which I'll get onto in a moment with my deck list. Also, the Lugia matchup not being all that favourable from the colourless side of things is is somewhat of a concern because it again is on a lot of players' radars right now. On to the deck list then. For me, it's a no-brainer to be cutting the Mawile. I feel like Gardevoir players are either going to be teching for Mawile already, because at the end of the day, players do net deck the most successful list themselves, or the Gardevoir players are choosing not to put down their water Pokemon in this matchup intentionally, just in case you are playing that Mawile. So I think in a closed deck list situation, even not playing a Mawile, your opponent is naturally having to play around this either with their deck decision or through their actual play. I personally would much rather commit this space to a Vengeful Punch. I think this card can be really helpful into the Chien-Pao matchup, which is currently showing as your least favourable of all the top archetypes. It's also massive into the Gardevoir matchup, which was essentially what Mawile was trying to do anyway, and every now and then this can come up in the mirror match. If ever a clean Charizard is knocking out your Charizard EX that has a Vengeful on it, it can often set them up for a later game Burning Darkness. Outside of that, I've kept things as is with the most successful Brazilian lists. I've also been really intrigued by the Lost Zone variation of Charizard. This is the list that has the best time into the Zard mirror matches, because you simply have more flexible options. You have early aggression from Cramorant, as well as having Lost Mine to Math Fix for you, as well as threatening multiple Pokemon at once. The matchup data is showing that this is slightly more fragile than the Arvanzard, so that would be the only thing I would say. This does seem to be a riskier play, but could pay off if Charizard comes out in its droves. For other options, I've made my speech about Mawile. I think it's a dead space in the deck because players will already be forced to play around it even before they've seen it in your list. Collapse Stadium could help you remove a heavily damaged Charizard. We know that one of the biggest selling points of this archetype is that it can tank in a number of matchups. And Vitality Band, similar to the Choice Belt that's already in the deck list, can help your Charizard knock out a Chien-Pao EX even after only taking a single prize card. It's also another way that you can get to that key 280 threshold, a prize card earlier, because 270 is such a poor number in the game right now. Into our top three then, we have Lost Zone Box. This has 149 community votes and achieved 1,264 championship points. This combined total is for Turbo variants as well as Kyogre. The deck didn't do all that well in Yokohama, and I think a big reason for that is the wave of colorless Lugia. You can see on the unfavorables that both archetypes are really poor for you, so any uptick in Lugia is quite unfortunate for the deck. Personally, I'm quite surprised to see the Turbo Lost Zone variants have fairly poor matchups into Charizard and Gardevoir. It feels like you have a lot of ways to create sneaky prize maps against them, but at the end of the day, these are sometimes chunkier decks that are going to be spamming Iono against you. It only takes one turn of freedom from them to get ahead enough in the game. I'll also note that one of your very favourables, the Mew matchup, is mostly because these decks are playing that Drapion V. So if you are choosing to make that cut, which many lists are doing as of late, you are definitely going to hurt your percentages. I'm personally of the belief that Mew will not be popular enough to be worth teching for, so I am going to make the flip-flop of Drapion to Mew EX myself, and outside of that, it's a very vanilla shell of the Turbo Lost Box variant. And I'm actually completely unchanged from Andrew Estrada's regional winning Kyogre build. I feel this treads the line of being a turbo build when it needs to, and can cash in on Aquastorm in matchups where it's most relevant. Notably, this really improves your Lugia matchup, so I do think there's still a lot of merit to this exact 60. For other options, I've already discussed Drapion, and if you respect Mew, you can still have it in your deck list, but there's also a lot of discussion around some additional single prize Pokemon coming into the deck list. Similar to Giratina, if you add in a Snorlax, you now have another single prize gate target, which can deal with opposing Snorlax in colourless Lugia builds. And Tropius is also an interesting idea. It does allow you to hit for weakness into Tyranitar V for a knockout. It can also help out against, of course, Charizard EX, which is also weak to grass. And even though you're not taking clean knockouts, you're putting yourself in really nice range for follow-up KOs. If I was looking to put in any of these single prize Pokemon, I would definitely consider Raihan for a little bit of extra energy acceleration, but also just to ease some pressure on your gates throughout the game. In at number 2 then, we have Gardevoir EX. It did exceptionally well in Yokohama. It got a top 4, a top 8, as well as 2 top 16 placements. The community is still right behind this archetype, and it's achieved 902 championship points in online tournaments. The deck seems to have a lot of close matchups, and definitely doesn't seem to be too phased about Charizard. Just because it's a dark type doesn't mean it's a concern for the Gardevoir players, as they are still trying to use their single prize Pokemon to create uptrade situations with reversal energy. The archetype actually appreciates Lugia's going towards the colourless build, and also appreciates any Mew players who are put off thanks to Charizard's existence. You'll notice in the decklist I am a Mew EX believer. I definitely think this gives you a huge sway in the Giratina matchup, and I think that's a matchup definitely worth respecting. Provided you turn attached to your Mew EX and Arcana twice, you you can genome hack, knocking out a Giratina VSTAR, and you keep yourself out of range of Cramorant and Sableye. So if you can combine this on an Iono turn, you're really putting the Lostina players on the back foot. The Mew EX also lets you pressurize Lost Zone in a lot of situations. Lost Box players often won't look to put Manaphy down against you, so you can sometimes hack their Greninja for multi-prize turns. And the same can be said for the mirror match. Ultimately, it becomes a game of cat and mouse between you and your opponent in a game 1 situation, where if the opponent is playing safe, they have to waste a bench space on their Manaphy, and if not, you're going to be able to carve out some pretty crazy turns. Partly because of Mew EX, I have had to sacrifice the Luminion Forest Seal Stone from the deck list, but it's also because you'll notice I'm not playing a penny, which means I'm not even allowed to play Luminion down in the Charizard matchup. And it means that if I'm not able to put these water Pokemon into play, I would rather just play a naturally higher count for supporters, which I've done in the previous deck list. So Gardevoir players are faced with a choice. Do they put Penny into their list and waste a slot to protect themselves against Mawile? Of course, Penny also has some upside into Lost Zone variants, also lets you get more aggressive with your Zacian, of course. Or do you simply choose not to play the Penny and say that every time you come up against Charizard, you won't be putting down Greninja, you won't be putting down Manaphy either. There's also still somewhat of a debate between which stadiums are best in the deck list. You'll notice I was playing Palpad Worker, but oftentimes people do choose to play a third stadium card or a Lost Vacuum. The Vacuum helps out against Box of Disaster, Vengeful Punch, and can also be cherry-picked with Mew throughout the game. Temple of Sinnoh is undoubtedly a Lugia tech card, and it does seem like there's a lot of popularity around that archetype right now, although it does conflict with your reversal energies, so something to watch out for there. And the Pokemon League HQ was piloted by a couple of high-profile players in Brazil to help out against those Lost Zone matchups once again, but it can also randomly help out against the Miraidon matchup, as well as against the colorless Lugia builds, which often lean into their basic attackers. In at number 1 then, I essentially had no choice but to give it to Lugia Archeops. It's had the highest amount of combined community votes, the highest amount of online CP, as well as a great showing in Yokohama, with a second place, a top 8, and a top 16, all of which with a colorless build of Lugia. So why has this archetype become so popular? The simple answer is Mew EX allows this deck to become much more versatile and has many more aggressive lines of play now. The online data is very generous for the colorless build of Lugia right now, with your only unfavorable matchup being Miraidon, and everything else in the game looking even or better. I do think this is probably quite generous, and I do believe there could be a decent amount of players who might be thinking about that extra Temple of Sinnoh in their deck list to flip this matchup. For example, the Giratina as well as the Gardevoir could definitely improve their percentages here. But in addition to that, I will certainly preach caution. From what I've played, this still isn't the most consistent archetype in the game, and we are still having to rely on that dicey turn 1 and 2, trying to achieve our summoning star. The deck list in front of you is fairly straightforward. I'm a believer of Radiant Charizard plus Luminous over the Luxray Reversal package, but those cards are sort of interchangeable, so you can take your pick there. Even though Zinnia's Resolve hasn't really come up in previous builds of Lugia, seeing as though we have so many important one-of attackers to time correctly throughout the game, as well as a number of energy that can end up in our hand, it's really nice to have some extra discard synergy, which doesn't force us to dump it all at once. You'll notice the Double Collapse Stadium is a big card in the deck list. It can be a great way for us to skew the prize trade and force an awkward map of the opponent, knowing that later on in the game we can burst the likes of Radiant Charizard, Weird EV, or Mew EX onto the board for a higher damage output play. And then we have the more traditional single strike build of Lugia. There could be a number of players still choosing to play this archetype if they don't trust the data or are still happy with the single strike build's matchup spread. A Cobalion is the tech card of choice right now to help out against the Charizard builds, allowing you to push your Tyranitar's damage output into that one-hit KO range. As mentioned, the Luxray Reversal package, mostly going into the colorless build of Lugia, is definitely respectable. Great Balls featured in the Yokohama second place list instead of Nest Balls, actually. So if you do want to spin that wheel, you can try gambling with Great Balls also. And Radiant Serena has actually come out of my single strike build in favor of the Cobalion, but could continue to give you a bit of help against the Lost Zone matchups and the Rapid Strike matchups. But if you don't believe in the Radiant Charizard, you could also add this into your colorless builds, knowing that Lost Zone box players will try and use a Greninja plus Sableye 2-turn combo to get rid of all of your energy acceleration in a turn. If you play the Serena against them, you completely ruin their game plan. I also want to touch base on just another few archetypes in the game right now. I know this isn't truly a top 10 because I've talked about so many variations of deck lists, but as mentioned earlier, Charizard has even more ways to develop, where there is Arceus builds out there, as well as Gallade, which had the high placement in Japan. So I do expect that there will be other Charizards that you could be facing in these regional tournaments. For the first time in a long time, Arceus hasn't made my top 10 altogether, and obviously it's still a powerful card. If you play the Tina builds, especially with some grass types, you can have a decent matchup spread relying on the Judge Path combination, or if you think you can make an Arc pile that has enough disruptive attacking options in your deck list that you can just outright wall or win games, that could also be an alternative line for this archetype to survive. And finally, even though I didn't show off a Palkia Chien-Pao variant, it was the most successful list in Yokohama, so if you're a stage 2 denier like me, that could be the build for you. I hope you enjoyed today's video and all the information that I've just dumped on you all. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you tomorrow for another video. Cheers.